representatives of the private sector, of academia, and of the UN. I will not go into personal introductions because that has already been done, and for the sake of time, each of our three speakers will make a presentation of about 10-12 minutes, and then we will again open the floor for your questions and comments. We will probably be a bit late going into lunch, but that's okay. Yes, if he says it's okay, he's seen the menu, I haven't. So
we'll do lunch at about 1:30.
All right, we'll do lunch about 1:30, so you're full of caffeine and energy, so that's really good. I'm not sure that I'll be really able to wrap up the discussion, but I'll do my best. More importantly, we listen to you first. Moses, thank you very much for coming from Kampala, and the floor is yours. Thank you. I'll be sitting on the side, actually, so feel free to stand.
Okay, there's a small website which you can visit when you have the time, but that's my email address. This work actually started in 2004, where Rockefeller Foundation invited me to innovate a product that was a sanitary pad, because what they had originally was costing them a lot of money. In 2005, they were spending about $400,000 a year to import sanitary pads. But then they said, if you can actually do some work for us from your product, first of all, we'll be able to employ the refugees, and of course, you'll be able to sell the sanitary pads to us at UNHCR. And I said, look, I'll take the challenge. And what has developed since then is that marker pads, the sanitary pads I'm talking about, have got a number of attributes, and one of them, they are the pads actually made in Africa. They're made initially for the schoolgirls who could not afford sanitary pads. But as of now, they are for everyone, those that cannot afford the sanitary pads. That is the bottom of the pyramid. But most important, that we were able to employ people using the lowest carbon footprints, and that's very important, in that the factory can be sustainable on solar energy alone. As you know, developing countries with energy and so on is a big problem. The other is that what eventually happens is that the product itself, 60% of the money goes back to the people who produce the sanitary pads. Different from a factory whereby what you make, a lot of it goes back to the entrepreneur. Now, we took advantage of a vast amount of raw material, that is the papyrus. If you actually stood somewhere along here, as far as the eye can see, you'll be able to see this raw material. It grows along the river Nile as a natural product. For those of you who remember, the Egyptians actually made paper out of this. Took advantage of this one and actually created sanitary pads out of it. A closer look at them would be you actually be able to see the sanitary pad. Now, what people ask, what about the environment? Actually, if you cut the papyrus properly at the bottom here, it will grow every 6 months. You can actually harvest the same product over and over again. So the idea of spoiling the environment doesn't actually exist. I want to show you how we produce marker pads. First of all, you harvest the product, the raw material, and then process it in some kind of fiber. And we're actually using the simplest tools possible in order to produce this. And you can see refugees actually working away in their own environment without going to what you call a proper factory environment. They can work at home, they can actually work into a place which is provided by the Uganda government. And here they're still using simple tools to actually make the absorbent paper, as you can see wherever they are. Very simple tools indeed, and very simple skills development. Then they move on to actually produce the rest of the product, the absorbent, using what we call the drying racks. As you can see, they are actually made out of simple materials and simple wood, and they actually employ them to use whatever sunshine they can find anywhere, anyhow. And they are actually drying this in the open sun. Of course, you ask what happens when it rains. We have made provision such that they cover it is threatening to rain. Of course, they do some now and then, but when I realized that I could, as an engineer, I could actually make drying racks made out of the kiln, electric and so on, the cost is not enormous and of course not sustainable. But we take advantage of the sunshine and we actually go ahead and so on. After that, they actually go into the house and actually make the parts using very simple sealing machines, which I most sort of modified from what is available that you see plastic. Then they sit away in here and do the work. And these are powered by solar panels somewhere here. And as you can see, This lady, Juliet, is my assistant. She's a graduate of education. I employed her right from the beginning to make sure that what we produce is being able to be tested by the women themselves, and also the project control is by the women. Other than me as a man, of course, I will not be able to test the sample time. But nonetheless, we have got this lady. This is a refugee. This is my employee. My employee is actually situated in Kampala. This man is 300 kilometers away. They communicate on a daily basis and make sure that the actual refugees are able to produce a product that is acceptable on standards by the customer. That is the United Nations Commission for Refugees. So there is a communication link between the two, and it works very well. Now, we have solar panels, as I said, that actually run the factory, nothing else, just to run the small sealers. The rest is manual, and we have a serene water in 2 water tanks, because you need a lot of water to actually run this thing on once. Eventually, people have asked, look, how do you manage that the sanitary pads are not dangerous? So actually sterilize them using a UV light, such that you are able to have a product that is accepted by the customer, and at the same time, of course, attractive to any other. Now, you would ask, how do we pay these fellows? We are paid by the product. Whatever they produce, they are paid. And the payment is done again by this guy who is running the refugee settlement project. And everybody is paid once every month. And religiously, not as somebody was saying earlier, how do you make sure that you don't cheat these people? They are paid the same price as anyone else. Whether they work in Kampala or anywhere else, they are actually paid the same amount. And they're very transparent. We ask some of these refugees to come to Kampala and check that the salary they're getting is the same wage as the other people are getting elsewhere. Now, what's the way forward? The way forward is we think that UNHCR, together with InterAid Uganda, we have actually made a partner that beginning this month, we'll be able to employ refugees in Kampala itself in order to scale up what we are actually doing. The idea is that since it has worked already 300 kilometers away from Kampala, it should be able to work also within Kampala. So we're beginning with 20 refugees to employ them, and over the next 2 years or so, we should be able to employ about 100 of them or more, depending on whether UNHCR is prepared to go along with us. The agreement between us is that the more they order from us, the more refugees that we're going to employ, and we hope we should be able to duplicate this one somewhere in Nairobi and possibly elsewhere. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Moses. We'll get the 3 presentations and then open the floor. So, Cindy?
I can start with thanking you, but maybe you can...
Yes.
So, I'll ask you to shift your minds from Makapats to the role of diaspora. It's quite a big leap, but basically I want to use the 10 minutes that I have to make you reflect a little bit on the role of diasporas in refugee livelihoods, and specifically the role of private sector. And I think it was interesting the way that Now had this model where on the one hand you have refugee livelihoods, on the other hand, or refugees, on the other hand you have the private sector. And I think in talking about diasporas, we might actually be able to combine the two and to think differently about who actually this private sector is. Now, when I talk about diasporas, I'm talking about migrant communities that maintain contact and networks with their country of origin. And those networks and contacts can be political, sociocultural, but also economic, and very importantly economic. There's a lot of different contributions that refugees who move to places like the UK, the US and others, a lot of contributions that they make. First of all, just by sending remittances to their family members, and that might have all kinds of implications for what the family members can do in terms of business investments, but also they themselves contribute money to specific investments. And then finally, you can even imagine diaspora-related larger businesses that contribute, that engage in corporate social responsibility, for example, the Hawala, the remittance transfer system. I will mainly rely on examples from the Somali diaspora. And I've talked to Somalis in different places around the world. Somalis in Minneapolis is a very large community, in the Netherlands, in Oslo in Norway, recently also in Columbus. And it's very clear that many of them remain very strong or maintain very strong connections with their country of origin, but also their region of origin. And they, many of these contributions are actually investments in people as well as investments in specific projects, investing in their region of origin in different ways. Just to, for those of you who are not aware of this, just to put the scale of this, remittances to Somalia are estimated to be, I think, between 1.3 and 2 billion. And that is, thank you, yes, a lot, indeed. And in many other places as well, it's at least, in the case of Somalia, it's by far more than the GDP, but in many other places, it's at least 50% of a country's GDP, foreign direct investment, etc. So that is something to be very aware of. So the private sector is often actually diaspora run. We think of the private sector as something that's separate, but it's actually often diaspora. So former refugees, if you want to say, or still refugees, depending on how you define. And they engage in a number of different phases. So you identified the emergency phase as one, and then the kind of protracted refugee situation as another case. I would also want to add upon return, and I think that's very important. Thinking about refugee issues and protection, we also have to think about the private sector upon return and what they're doing to stabilize conditions in the region of origin. Maybe a number of examples from this. In the emergency phase, it's a little bit unconventional maybe, but investments in the smuggling business, which allow people to leave a very unsecure area, and the consequence that has. In protracted refugee situations, like I said, I did most of my work in Dadaab, and there's a lot of business going on in Dadaab, in the different refugee camps that is started up by those who maybe originally lived in the camps but are now based in Canada. So just to give you one example, this is in 2000 actually, computer business started up with some computers that were shipped by a relative in Canada. And in 2000 was a very good business. And I know that now has also experienced examples in Ghana, for example, similar initiatives. Upon return, very fascinating at the moment, Somalia, there are a lot of people returning to Mogadishu. And there's a lot of investment going on in Mogadishu by Somalis who had not seen Mogadishu for 15, 20 years and who are now returning. The investments that are made at the moment in Mogadishu are done by maybe Turkish or a number of the kind of non-traditional donors, but also by the Somalis returning from the US. And there are two very interesting examples, a dry cleaners that was set up in Mogadishu. That made BBC set up by someone who was educated in Malaysia and then worked in the airport in Dubai, and then just realized that actually people who live in Mogadishu, businessmen, government officials, are sending their suits to Kenya for dry cleaning. That's the market. And then another man returning from the US with $200,000 to set up a hotel in Mogadishu, hotel and restaurant, Jazeera Beach. I hope you can imagine going there in the near future. So a lot of discussion about how crazy this man is or how visionary this man might be. So why is it that a lot of the business investments in the role of the private sector or the engagement of the private sector is actually by those who are in the diaspora? I think there are a large number of very good reasons for that. First of all, often the investments are in sectors that diaspora members want to use themselves. They're in communications, they're in transportation, they're in remittance sending companies, the Hawala, So they profit, and their family members profit from these businesses. Secondly, also they are the first to realize the business potential, both in refugee areas but also in a region that is relatively unstable. Who's willing to invest in Mogadishu at the moment? And that's not just because this particular man setting up a hotel wants to do good for the country. No, it's because he sees this as a business opportunity. And also because very often they might not have the same kind of returns when they invest in something in Columbus, Ohio, because there are much greater restrictions that they might face. And also maybe because, well, the risks in Mogadishu are larger, so the profits are larger. Another reason is that people are willing to invest in their region and country and people. So a lot of it is maybe not necessarily just the business interest of it, but it could be partly. So the fact that if you're sending $1,000 to your brother to set up clothes shops in Nairobi, then that brother should not come to you again for his monthly $100 or $200 remittances. Then, okay, that means, okay, now you're independent and you should be able to manage your own business in a way. And also maybe this idea that by investing in your country of origin or your region of origin, you contribute to stability. And I've had actually in interviews when I asked people about their political engagements with Somalia that people said, well, actually, I'm so fed up with engaging with politics, but I feel that if I invest and if I help create a middle class, that might lead to stability. That gives me a better chance of contributing to stability than by trying to become the next prime minister or something of the sort. And finally, also, of course, these business investments are very much related to retirement plans. So if you have a large business, if you have a hotel in Mogadishu, and you're considering, am I going to relocate my family from Columbus, Ohio, or wherever, to Mogadishu, then having a hotel there is a good way to start. Now I want to close with just some three things that I thought of that are different and that can be, I wasn't sure what to call this, challenges, risks, but maybe also opportunities. Just realizing that things are a little bit different maybe than how we approach. And I think Tanya was alluding to some of these things as well. First of all, the fact that very often these engagements, these economic engagements, are mixing family, group concerns and strategies and business strategies. That's the first one. And like I said, it's for good and for bad. Secondly, also these aims are not just, and at times even not primarily monetarily. So by investing in a hotel or by investing in a computer business in the camps, yes, maybe you're making a profit and maybe you're contributing that way, but at the same time you're also concerned with your family, giving them job opportunities. At the same time, it's about your status as someone who's left and is expected to do something for the family. So there's all kinds of social status, all kinds of other aims that are important there. And then thirdly, which is also really important to underscore, which maybe links with what is specific about refugees and this issue of protection, is that, of course, diasporas are produced by various stages of the conflict. So they're part of the conflict, and that also means that very often these kind of economic engagements have political implications and also often are very political in a way. So not from the Mogadishu example, I don't know it very well, but from investments in hotels in Gaela, that has been very much to do with clan politics, local clan politics. So again, that is something that I feel that we should really take the role of diaspora in private sector livelihood engagement seriously, but when we do that, we have to take care of the fact that there are some substantial differences. So the political role, the mixing with the family, and also the fact that it's not just monetary reasons why people engage. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
examples of refugee activities, refugee livelihoods, and in particular now this presentation with wealth groups. Yeah, I'm going to talk about what we've seen so far, but the first thing is that we do have, now at this stage, we have 15 livelihood assessments that we have been doing over the past 4 years, with loads of information there. And that is, I think, our contribution to the beginnings of this project is really to share this information with you. It's accessible, and I'm sure you would probably make better use of it than in some cases in the field operations. So how UNHCR has been responding and supporting refugee livelihoods has changed a lot. And now we're in a phase where we're moving towards a more structured approach of doing that, and a much more collaborative approach. In some of my very first missions to the field 4 years ago, one of my first missions to Bangladesh, the camps, I asked about refugee activities, refugee livelihoods, and I was taken to the training area. It's like a hangar where people are making soap all day, they're making toothpaste, and not getting paid very much for it at all. I'm saying, okay, so, that's it. Do you have a market for this? Are people buying this? No. This is really part of it feeds into the distribution chain. It's a non-food item that will be provided freely. Then we walked outside, and in the streets, I saw lots of market stands. Thinking, well, this is interesting. Who are the owners of these market stands? And what were they selling? Refugees, of course. What were they selling? Toothpaste and soap. Of a brand of toothpaste and soap that people actually want to buy. So there was a real disconnect here between, on the one hand, the support that we're providing, the needs that we think we are meeting by either training people or providing them activities or supplying them with goods for regular household consumption, and on the other hand, the fact that people want to buy something else. So Bangladesh was one of the first countries we did a full livelihood assessment in. We mapped out the strategies that people are putting in place, the wealth groups. We have 4 different wealth groups in each of the camps, and also found that people are going in and out of the camp. In spite of the restriction for movement, people will pay a little bit to the guards who will let them out. And they'll travel to a city, to the towns, come back, or travel further to some fields and come back. And others will open little businesses, which are not registered, but are here. So the host communities come into the shops to buy things. They also employ refugees to work in their shops that are just outside the camp. So all this economic activity is taking place. And this is in a setting in Bangladesh which is legally, it's one of the most difficult settings, where the right to work is really not there. So going back to these livelihood assessments we have done, our first concern was really to show our own implementing partners and our colleagues in UNHCR that refugees are not a homogeneous group. This is also, before joining UNHCR, I was working with Save the Children and Action Against Hunger, and I carried out a lot of household economy assessments. And I think once you start seeing things in that way, you can't turn back. It means that our responses have to be completely in line with what we see refugees are capable of doing already. So the starting point for a livelihood response is, what are people's capacities? Not what are their needs. It's really capacity-based. This is one of the frameworks that we're trying to roll out now throughout the whole organization with our partners. And this shows you that as a result, it's a generic model, but as a result of the wealth ranking and the understanding of people's different levels of wealth, whether they're very poor, somewhere in the middle, or better off, the layers of support that we can provide are completely different. Completely different. We're lucky if we manage to maintain people in this situation. In a normal sort of poverty reduction strategy, in a development program, you would really seek to graduate people up. Here, our first concern is make sure people don't lose their assets. Whatever skills they have, whatever savings they brought with them, let's maintain those. So that's the first thing. Just going back to some of the countries I've seen just over the past few years, and the conversations earlier about people's people's aversion to risk and whether people are entrepreneurs. I fully agree. I mean, whether in the refugee population or in ourselves, the majority of us are not necessarily entrepreneurs, and we're quite happy to be employed and to have regular wages. However, it's very, very social and cultural specific as well. In the Somali refugees in Doloado, when I went there earlier this year, I held several group discussions with Somali women, and in fact we divided them by age group, because the women who came there recently and are still young have not had a lot of entrepreneurship experience before displacement, whereas the more mature women all had. This ranged from having a hotel business, in fact, to transport business all over Nauru, all over Somalia, to little stores. So here, the trend was that, yes, almost all women here have had some kind of finger in some kind of micro business at some point in time, and the wealth differentiation then played out to see how big those businesses were. But what was consistent here is that none of them had been able to set up anything so far since they had arrived in Dolo, because the level of support was very small, and access to remittances is still not quite there. There's no Hawala system, there's no transfer services, and also the border is very dangerous. So it will probably evolve, but right now that was the case. Refugees from Iraq that are in Jordan, several years ago we also developed a big plan to support these refugees, and found that the majority had been previously in Iraq happily employed by the state for the most part, and this was the bulk of people who were now receiving cash handout by UNHCR. Some of them had managed to obtain work permits to work in. There was some occupations that were really in demand, and that the Jordanian government helped, like doctors, physical therapists, a few trades. But otherwise, most people didn't really know what to do. And when we suggested to support some home-based businesses, the answer was that, well, no, this is not us. We don't do home-based stuff. I'm not going to do crochet all day and sell it to a little tradesman on the street. It's just not my thing. We're not entrepreneurs. It's not what we want to do. And a huge contrast now with the Syrian refugees who are coming into Egypt. Our office has just been approached by both a group of business owners in Cairo, and also by the Syrian refugees in different instances, to try to put the two together. The Syrians have been coming in, they're accessing financial services, they're registering, they want to register their own businesses very, very productively, and the employers in Syria, the private employers, are coming to our office to help access that workforce as well. So this is really the perfect combination of the cultural factor, the political factor. Economically, in some cases, I was very surprised to hear, because the unemployment rate is very high in Egypt. But for some reason with the Syrians, it's okay. So there is this, our colleague who just started there as livelihoods officer gave us this example, and yeah, he thinks that's really this perfect combination of this cultural aspect. The Syrians are very well culturally integrated into Egypt as well. So it varies greatly, and I think the cultural factor really has to be slotted in. So I'm just going to move on now to just here to present the framework that we have. The reason why we're doing these livelihood assessments is not to have an assessment report. We're then using the data to formulate these targeted strategy over several years. I mean, for UNHCR, this is very unusual to plan over several years, because our programming system doesn't allow us to do that. We do it anyway. It also helps us to identify the partners that we're going to be working with. So, yes, Jean-Francois, you're familiar with this rant of mine. You've had it many times. Within our programming framework, we identify different levels of and different durations of support. So the livelihood provisioning, I'm sure some of you are familiar with the provision, protection, promotion framework, which we fully adopted into how we're working. And it's helping us to convince our own colleagues, for a start, to start investing into livelihood support from the beginning, in the emergency. I saw a slide earlier on today which didn't have livelihoods in the emergency phase, and I would urge you to change that. It's really about meeting basic needs and minimizing expenditure. This is already a livelihoods intervention. We're helping people not sell their assets. So a cash-based assistance, this is already livelihood response. And you can see it here again at the very beginning, grant assistance. Livelihood protection, this is again, it's direct kind of support, and it's more medium to short to medium term. This is what UNHCR and our partners typically do. The skills training, helping people acquire local language skills, accessing whatever, grants for productivity, livestock, all the usual type of support. Enterprise promotion, employment promotion, all this is here. And then the livelihood promotion, which is the longer term indirect. This is about us working with institutions, and this usually is the public sector to begin with, working with institutions to help refugees secure the right to work, get the right documentation so they can open a bank account. And more we are moving towards this promotion and advocacy activities with the private sector. Banks, for a start, is hugely important. How are people going to keep their money in a safe place if they don't have a bank account? The other benefit of having what we call a comprehensive plan for livelihood support is that we can then see who does what. The plan helps us define, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do some provisioning, protection, promotion. These are all the elements. These are the target groups. And now who does what? These exercises are also an opportunity for UNHCR to be much more collaborative than it usually is, and not only rely on a response with our own regular partners, who are very often humanitarian actors, who do a fantastic job for humanitarian work, but who don't understand markets, who don't understand how it is to work with development partners, and especially the market link. So we end up with very comprehensive plans, and I think this pale blue part is probably the refugees themselves, what they bring to the table. And then what everybody else brings to the table. Youth organizations, NGOs, UNHCR, governments, and private sector. And here you see that the overlap isn't full because there's only a portion that UNHCR is going to do. This is really part of our own internal advocacy to encourage our own colleagues to think outside the box and think that livelihood support is actually much broader than what we can do. And most of the time, people actually don't even bother with our support. They just get on with it and make their living. Sorry, I'm just taking a long time, but going back to the question that we were looking into today, I was happy to see that now you had also these similar categories, refugees as entrepreneurs, as employees, and as consumers, because just thinking about today, that's what I came up with. But I didn't have refugees as beneficiaries. But I find them very helpful categories, especially for this kind of work we're going to be doing. The question being, how can we promote the value of refugees for the private sector? And also linking this to the host government, because as you rightly said earlier, you can't avoid, we are working with national policy and in that framework. And we have to tread very carefully in some countries. So as entrepreneurs, we've seen already refugees working inside the value chains and contributing to the value chain. We had an example freshly from Senegal, where our organization has actually partnered with a business called Jardin Tropical Semence. JTS is pretty much acting as an NGO would, with skills training and so forth. The plus, provision of inputs to some degree, but the plus is that they actually help with the marketing. And the profits come back to the refugees. JTS also help organize the cash flow so that the profits are sustainable. So this is a nice example of a partnership. Business networks and local partners, I think, especially through the presentation on the diaspora, it really shows that somehow enabling the link and also using technology to reinforce that the networks between entrepreneurs, both in the displaced country and in the host country, is really key. Of course, as entrepreneurs, refugees create more demand for business support services and for legal services, which itself is a business. Job creation, of course, and the tax income. We had very nice data coming from Pakistan, with the tax income that was generated from Afghan entrepreneurs. I mean, this is a fantastic way to obtain buy-in from the government. As a workforce, this is right now where UNHCR is doing better with partners in linking up with the private sector. We've had partnerships with employers from the private sector. I want to talk about one in particular because also this touches on the aspect of protection. In Bangladesh, part of that strategic plan was to work with a social enterprise called Hatagonano, who make the most lovely children's toys and crochet things. They were willing to open new production units in the refugee hosting areas. So it was a huge investment for them, and our partnership, we helped them, we helped fund the creation of these new units. But within the first year, that would be it. So in exchange, they produced the training and all the materials and everything so that refugees could go into these centers, produce, and be paid per piece of what they produce. Completely up to them whether they want to work or not. They're paid per piece. So they can choose to go 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. They get trained, they could move up the ladder of the small factory. It all seemed absolutely wonderful. I loved that project. But our protection colleagues there went on monitoring visits and put their finger on all these issues to do with the working conditions, no windows, this and that. The centers were not, all they were claiming to be. There was no place for the children to sit. It was, everything was just wrong from the protection angle. At the same time, the women came to the centers to make money, and they said that this was better than what they would be doing. The conditions even were at least equal to the other conditions they would have. So there's a real tension between how protected we want refugees to be and how happy we'd like them to be making a living. I don't think there's an answer to that, and that project certainly had a lot of room for improvement. But when we're talking about the role of UNHCR in protection, so far what we've seen from the livelihoods team's perspective is that it's stifling. It's not that link between protection and livelihoods and making a living is not an enabling link. So we need to turn this around somehow. Referral to job placement agencies. This is the biggest, by far, the biggest linkage we have with the private sector. Numerous countries in the Americas, in Middle East. We have through direct partnerships where we will fund the services of the private job placement agency. They can help refugees on their career tracks, whether this is enterprise or employment. They will look at CVs, advertise, put them in touch, have with employers as interns or as laborers. So this is very good. We have also direct referrals through Manpower in South Africa and also in Argentina. So Manpower they're really interesting, in fact, to work with, to explore the relationship. I think this is something we can deepen. And it's a non-financial relationship. It's just, we just talk with them and then that's it. It's they cover their costs the way they usually do. Career counseling and orientation, work permits. We have a lot of sponsored internship schemes with local enterprises. This is across Europe. Have done a lot of this, but in many countries this is what we do with local enterprises. So things are happening. The other challenge is how do we get all this information? Because here we're really just scratching the surface, but I think if we're asking the field for more systematic information, we can find it. And finally, as consumers, obviously income and trade is the best way to boost the private sector. Cash-based interventions, there's a huge interest right now in the whole humanitarian community, this has been several years now, in cash-based interventions. And from a livelihoods unit perspective, we're all for it, absolutely. Again, there's all these tensions between the protection and the economic perspectives. But certainly, there's stimulation for the market. And if it's done in the right environment, this is really the way ahead from our viewpoint. Vouchers for selected goods. We've been using vouchers for a very long time, whether this is seeds, food, clothes. We're introducing a scheme in Durieux on meals for training. So rather than just be given a plate of food by the NGO, we're going to issue an invitation to bid to the local refugees and to the refugee women's groups to see if they can do the catering service in a standard voucher. So it's just these simple ways you can just stimulate enterprise. Again, vouchers for selected services. We have skills training, job placement, legal advice. We're not using those, but this is an area where I think we could really develop much more. And when we are working with microfinance institutions and giving them grants to either set up a guarantee fund or to start disbursing loans, this is a way of sponsoring a private enterprise as well. And it's really, we are advocating for refugees to access financial services as consumers, as clients. We have in our guidelines that we issued on microfinance, it's this whole notion of refugee as a client, which is also new to some of the ears in the organization, but it's how, this is the reality. Yeah. So I think that's it. Yeah, I'm going to skip this because you all know these things. Just one other point on how much does livelihoods mean to UNHCR. The budget, which is the wish lists for this year, for all our operations together, was 200 million. Last year we had 79 countries that were budgeting for livelihoods. This year it's 87. So that's a lot of countries. The reality, however, is that only 30% of that budget really is met and is prioritized. Prioritized is what happens when we are given the real money that we can use, and then we sort of reallocate. This percentage rate varies from region to region, but it means, the reality is that for us, to really work on livelihoods seriously from the beginning is a big issue. When you have to choose between shelter or basic services and livelihoods, typically livelihoods comes last. And I mean, as I was saying to Stephanie just over the break, one of the entry points to our unit when an operation we haven't been in touch with before wants support is to say, we're going to run out of money for our cash support program in 6 months' time. So what can we do on livelihoods? We need everybody to be independent. And, you know, so give us a bit longer than 6 months, you know. So it's a very challenging environment, I think, institutionally, within which we are working. And I think we need to consider that in all the debates here, because as much as we can have fantastic ideas, the reality is at the end of the day, you've got people on the ground who are, you know, super busy, running around with all these priorities, and sometimes they just can't pick it up. So yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you.